Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode. In fact, it is the 33rd episode. I feel like that's some kind of lucky number or something, maybe. But it is the 33rd episode of Dear Dr. Fantasy. And my special guest for today is none other than a critical dragon, otherwise known as Dr. AP Canavan. Hello, AP. How are you today?
I am doing very well, Philip. Thank you very much for inviting me on here. But as I said just before we started,
Yes.
this whole doctor thing, like you're not going to ask me to grip the table, bend over, cough, anything like
Oh,
that. No,
no.
not
No.
that kind of doctor.
Not that kind of doctor, I'm afraid. I'm not a very useful sort of doctor. Which is an interesting story for those of you who haven't heard it yet. Some of you probably have, because I might have told it a couple times. How I even got the name Dr. Fantasy is really more or less AP's fault. It is sort of, kind of. I mean, I did once upon a time let him know that a couple viewers had referred to me as Dr. Fantasy, perhaps in a flattering manner. And he took this as a bit of a joke and in the middle of a video called me Dr. Fantasy. And somehow the name stuck. I
And yet, Philip, of the two of us,
know.
who has a doctorate in fantasy?
That's the best part of all, because I know it's slightly annoying to you.
But even then, the sobriquet applied to me that
Yeah,
some people know of Professor Fireballs.
yeah,
I'm not a professor. I don't teach.
I know.
Therefore, you are literally the professor, and I.
But Dr. Canavan, you are always teaching now. So that is why you are Professor Fireballs, and no one else can cast fireballs the way that you do. And I'm sure that everyone would agree with me on that. And it also pleases me immensely that it's sort of annoying to you that I'm Dr. Fantasy and you're Professor Fireballs. So, but
Oh,
I'm not laughing too much about that.
oh, and I cry myself to sleep every night because of it. Like
Yeah.
I'm wounded to the quick.
Why couldn't I be Dr. Fantasy?
Yes, yeah, I say that to myself every night. It's
I know.
you must have my place bugged to have recorded that.
I do. I do. I mean, you are my nemesis, so I have to watch out for you. But it is an interesting fact that you do, in fact, my PhD is in medieval literature, so I'm a fake. It's true. But your PhD is, in fact, in fantasy literature, which is so awesome and cool. And I think everybody would agree that it's just a wonderful thing that a person can have a PhD in fantasy, right? I mean, that is just, it's a wonderful thing.
But I'm curious, when you got your PhD, did it come on an illuminated manuscript?
On vellum, actually. Yeah.
Oh, how fancy.
Well, the hard part was I had to handwrite every essay and my dissertation with ink and a feather quill. So, yeah.
You,
But
you probably you probably could have faked it with a fountain pen.
I,
Just
if I'd
get one
been
of those
smart,
calligraphy nibs. Get one of the calligraphy nibs on the end of it. They never would have known.
if I'd been smarter, I would have done that, but oh well. So, so I'm intending to pick your brain a little bit today, because you are my guest for Dear Dr. Fantasy, and I do want to know about this PhD in fantasy literature and all. I know that you read hundreds and hundreds of books, fantasy books, for the purpose of this PhD. But before we get to that, I would love to talk about some of the reads that brought you to being a fantasy lover. Like, why did you become interested? Why would somebody do a PhD in fantasy? Obviously, there were some important books that you read along the way that brought you to that point where you decided, I'm going to do a PhD in fantasy literature. So, going on the premise that you are what you read, Dr. Canavan, what are some of the formative reading journeys of your life that you would consider to be explanations for who you are today?
Oh, I don't think I can blame books in any way for how I turned out. That seems an unfair burden to put on the books. Lots of people read those books and turned out completely normal. Um, I, I even if you ask members of my family, I have always read. like from when I was very, very tiny, I have loved books. And it was when I was a young kid, my dad used to come home from work, and this is a sort of sign of the times that people might find a bit strange now, but he would stop off on a Friday at the newsagent, the local corner shop, and he would get a selection of like chocolate bars and candies and sweets and various things like that, confectionery, things like, the various things that you would get Halloween. And he would pick up the comic that I was reading and the comic that my younger brother was reading.
Aha.
And so on a Friday, we would get to choose one treat, and we got our comic book. And that was it. That was, it seems so strange now when we think about how much like chocolate and various sweets and things that we consume, and it's so easy. But when I was growing up, it was a treat. It was a once a week treat.
Yeah.
And it was all wrapped up in, you got the comic book. And I'm sure there were earlier ones like the Dandy and the Beano and various things like that. But I remember the first one that I really remember having like reading every week was Transformers.
Oh, okay. Huh.
And I think at one point I had the run of, and it was the UK publication of it, but I had the run of like Transformers 1 to like 200.
Wow. Wow.
And let's not talk about what happened to them. It's a sore spot. But I had that complete run, and it was built up over like every Friday. My dad would come home from work, and you would get like a Crunchy or a Mars bar. And to stop fighting, of course, one week my brother got to choose first, and then the next week I got to choose first, because otherwise he took the thing that I wanted. Was always the argument. But that was from when we were very, very young. That we started out that way, and then like every Christmas getting an annual or that sort of thing. But my mum and dad took a view that they wanted to normalize having books in the house. They wanted to normalize reading.
Yeah.
And so like dad, obviously, like he used to love reading the paper, but he also loved like, and over the years, like he went through a phase of reading Dick Francis books and John Grisham books and Dan Brown books, and my mum went through a phase and she read Agatha Christie, but between the two of them, there were always books circulating through our house.
Hmm.
And because of that, the idea of sitting down and the TV being off and the fire lit and like everyone sitting in the same room, save money on heat.
Yeah.
But everyone's sitting in the same room, the fire lit to keep the room warm, and just sitting reading a book.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah.
And because of that, it was normalized at such an early age that um, it never seemed strange to me. We watched far less TV in my house than I think a lot of households.
Hmm.
And my dad had no interest in it. My mum didn't have a huge amount of interest. And when you have a number of children and they're all competing about the thing that they want to see, and you have a limited number of televisions, you had to find something else to do while they were watching something that you had no interest in, hence books.
Wow.
So that was something I remember. And then the next thing was, and I may be misremembering the title, but there was either a fortnightly or a monthly magazine thing. And I think it was called Storyteller.
Okay.
And it was made up of reprints of fairy tales, serialized children's stories. And it came as a sort of magazine with a cassette on the front of the audio narration so that you could read along with the narrator. So it was, instead of like your parents reading you a story, we got Storyteller, and we had a little briefcase that all of the tapes clipped into. And again, this was the treat that we got. And I remember there was Groger the Golden Ogre, Shorty the Satellite,
Huh.
but you had Puss in Boots, The Emperor's New Clothes,
Okay.
the one about the tailor who killed all of the flies with his belt. And it was like
Oh, yeah, that rings
seven
a
with one
bell.
blow.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
like I remembered all of those, and we had those growing up. So then, because of that, when it came to say my birthday, and what we get AP, well, there's a collection of stories for 5-year-olds. There's a collection of stories for 6-year-olds. There's a collection of stories for 7-year-olds. There
Huh.
used to be a whole lot of these anthologies that were meant to be age specific. What they soon found was, well, just add on a couple of years, and AP hasn't read that one yet. And so it very quickly, books were the easiest things to get me. And I loved I loved strange, like a lot of kids. I loved fairy tale. I loved folklore. Those things that were different. I didn't want to read about, although I did end up reading a bunch of them, but school days novels about someone going to school, and you're like, why do I want to read about an English boarding school? You know,
Yeah.
that's not. There's no nostalgia in it for me because where I grew up was very much not English boarding school territory.
Right.
It was an alien culture because I'm not English. And so if you're already making that leap to a new culture and a new setting, and why not go to Middle Earth?
Huh.
Why not go to Mars? Why not go to alien planets? Why not go to fantasy realms? And that was part and parcel of it. Like you, I read the Lord of the Rings when I was quite young.
Yeah.
I made the mistake, perhaps, of reading The Lord of the Rings before I read The Hobbit.
Oh, yeah. Well,
And so going and reading The Lord of the Rings, and like I'll admit, it took me a while to work through that as a kid.
yeah.
But I probably understood 70% of it. Like, but I loved it. And sometimes when you got stuck on a word, like I had a dictionary and I would go and look up the word. Funny thing about the dictionary, absolutely rubbish story, but at least it explains all the words. Um,
It's
but
helpful.
I read the whole of the Lord of the Rings and was like, this is brilliant. And they went, oh, there's another book, The Hobbit. I went, oh, great. I got that, and I felt it was such a childish letdown
Yeah. Yeah.
after the Lord of the Rings. No, like subsequent to that, like, I know scholars who have gone over the writing and the structure, and they've put all of the amazing stuff that's in The Hobbit. I don't mean to disrespect it, but as someone who hadn't read an absolute ton of stuff when I was younger,
Right.
read the Lord of the Rings. I wanted more Lord of the Rings, and I read The Hobbit and went, no, I wanted more Lord of the Rings, not the sort of the childish version of
Right. Right. Right.
it. And that launched me into the trips down to the local bookshop
Huh.
and the trips down to the library. My mum would take us down to the library, and it was okay. P, you're allowed to get out 2 books. Okay, 3. Right, 4 is the absolute limit. Right, those 5 are the 5 that you're allowed to get out.
I know that. I know that with my daughter, it's the same thing. I mean, I end up with this big stack of books trying to leave them. The librarians would be, wow, when's she gonna read all those? And I was like, tomorrow, probably, this will be done. Yeah.
And then like going back and returning them all and sort of going, right, do you have anything? And they've gone, you've read through that entire section. You're like, well, is
Yep.
there anything in the sort of the adult fantasy section? Oh, well, you might be a bit young for that. And it's like, well, I'm reading Dune at the minute by Frank Herbert. And they're like, well, fair enough. Why don't we go over here and have a look? And the librarians were so nice.
Yeah.
But one of the big advantages I had was obviously I had elder siblings.
Ah,
So
yes.
I could read their bookcases as well, which is how I read through a bunch of horror because my one of my brothers went through a horror phase, and
Oh,
so I
wow.
read was it James Herbert and Stephen King and a bunch of stuff like that, and I realized they weren't for me. It wasn't my flavor of things, but I did read a bunch.
Huh. Yeah, because
Um,
I don't know you as a horror reader today. I mean, I think we've talked a little bit about the genre, and it's not your favorite sort of read usually, but
no,
yeah.
and again, it's not because I think the genre is bad or I don't think there isn't good writing. It's just when you're reading for pleasure, you're reading the things that you like.
Yeah.
And you will dabble outside of that to go, well, maybe I might like this. And you try to give it a fair shake. You read a couple of different authors, you read a couple of books. And they were fascinating stories, but uh, my imagination took them to places that mm,
So in other words, you don't read horror for the same reason I don't, because you're a chicken.
I'm a big scaredy cat. Yeah. And um I don't like sitting in the house and going, is that a demon in the shadows? No, AP, don't be ridiculous. You are a grown man. But I just read it in a book and it's really
I
scary.
know.
Yeah. So I'm a big fraidy cat. But in saying that, like my sister when she was much younger, and like she read like Sweet Valley High, Sweet Valley Twins, like all of that. I read a bunch of those as well
Yeah, yeah.
because you go like there were books. I'm just going to read them. I want to see what I read my dad's Dick Francis books. His the who did I mentioned the name earlier? Some of All Fears and The Cardinal at the Kremlin.
Oh,
Um,
yes, you did. And I can't remember though.
yeah, but I read all of the spy thrillers that he had.
Yeah.
I read a bunch of those, and I would read everything, but it was like raiding my brother's shelf to get. He had all of the Dune books by Herbert, so I read through all of those. And again, I was still relatively quite young, so it was a bit of a struggle. I think my first reading of Dune Messiah, I was like, well, like, but I wanted more sandworms and more things exploding and fights.
Yeah.
Um, but like looking back on it now, I'm really glad I read that sort of stuff. But
Yeah.
I also loved franchise novels. I was reading. I remember the Star Wars. Was it Timothy Zahn did the Thrawn trilogy? So there was a
Okay.
whole bunch of the Star Wars stories, and I read a whole lot of those. There were the Forgotten Realms books, and
Yes.
that's when I started going to the bookstore on my own
Okay.
to spend my hard-earned pocket money from cutting grass and lifting things and doing chores, and
Uh,
you would scrimp and save. But I would go down to the bookstore and I would go, that book, that book, that, and I would buy a whole load of them. And I got to know the bookseller in the bookstore who looked after the science fiction and fantasy section.
okay.
And it got to the stage that I would come in and I would say hello, and she'd go, "Oh, we've just got the new catalog in about books that we're thinking of ordering in the new sort of thing. Do you want to have a look?" And so I was going through the bookseller's catalog, going, "Oh, I definitely want that. I've been looking forward to this for ages. Oh, that's coming out. I didn't know that was coming out yet. Can you put me down?" And anything that I wanted, she would order
Oh,
and then would add in a couple of extras because she went, if AP's reading it, it's likely that someone else is going to read
okay. So you dictated the fantasy and science fiction tastes of an entire town then.
it. Unfortunately, yes. But yeah, they ordered other things as well. But that's part of what it was. And if we were going away on a family holiday, my mom would say, "Right, AP, you're allowed a couple of books. We'll take you down. You can buy some books because it's going to be a long car journey." And I would sit in the back of the car and read.
Oh, that's good that you could. Not everyone can read in the car. Yeah.
My sister, on the other hand,
Yeah.
can barely sit in the back of a car
Yeah.
without getting car sick, let alone read in a car. But when, being, if someone was actually picking me up from school, I'd get into the back of the car and I would pull the book out of the bag and I would just start reading. Getting
Yeah.
on the school bus, find my seat, take the book out of the bag, and I would start reading. I became I wouldn't say obsessive, but that was just the thing that I fell into. I was always looking forward to a new book to read.
Well, it gave you obviously a place to exercise your young imagination and to explore other worlds. And I can imagine that being an important part of just developing as a person, And I always felt that way. Like when I read Lord of the Rings, it was just sort of a place where obviously there's great peril and danger and all of that sort of thing, but it was a place where I could work out. I would finish reading that evening or whatever, and then come back from that world feeling like things made a little more sense, as a kid, I guess. And that was part of the beauty of it for me, for sure. I think most
I mean,
people around here relate to that.
and it's there are two aspects, particularly about fantasy reading, that I really appreciated, particularly as I got older. And one was it expanded my vocabulary.
Hmm.
Like the reading, obviously, that we did at school. I went to a good school. They encouraged us to read. They had little competitions of here write in a book report of the books that you have read, and so you started like that week, and I would put in like 3 novels or 4 novels, whatever it was, and then the next week fill in more, and then ask for another sheet and fill in more. And one day, like my teacher sort of looked at me and went like, "Are you just making these up?" And I went, "Pick a book, pick any book off that list, and I'll tell you about it." And other people did other things. I read, but it greatly expanded my vocabulary at the time, which meant when we were studying things, my reading comprehension kept going up and up and up. That
Yeah.
even words that I'd never seen before, and you know this, you understand through context.
Hmm.
And the broader your understanding of all of these different things, the easier it becomes to understand things through context.
Yeah.
And so that really helped with a lot of my schoolwork just because I was reading all the time.
Hmm.
But the other thing that it did, and it sort of goes to I think, the escapism aspect, particularly of fantasy. There were times when I was growing up, where I was growing up, that it wasn't a particularly pleasant place.
Yeah.
Um, my family, absolutely wonderful. We, like everyone, we made the best of where we were.
Right.
But when you're surrounded by that, it was a safe refuge.
Well, they didn't call
And,
it troubles for nothing, right?
and in that refuge, there were
Mhm.
these examples, and it's perhaps what drew me more towards fantasy than, say, science fiction. But
Yeah.
there were these examples of people sacrificing themselves for others,
Mm.
people holding to a moral good, regardless of what it cost them personally,
Right.
people going through terrible trials and these really difficult situations and
Yep.
emerging out the other end. And so there was an optimism to it. There was
Mm.
a heroism that when you're surrounded by elements of violence like that, and
Yeah.
sometimes the darkness and the grimness of it, you have multiple responses. One is like, if you didn't laugh, you'd cry. So, there's a lot of dark humor emerges from
Yeah.
that.
So you're talking about what Donaldson refers to as reintegration, right? Fantasy as the literature of reintegration. You experienced that. Yeah.
And it's as if, and we talk about epic fantasy, very much modern fantasy. We go, oh yeah, it's Tolkien. Tolkien is where modern fantasy comes from. You go, a lot of the modern genre coalesced around Tolkien. But let's face it, Tolkien is one stepping stone
Yeah.
on a tradition that stretches back as far as human memory does.
Yep.
That cave paintings
Mm.
telling the story of the hunt and the great hunter, um, the the stories of mythological creations, the stories of strange spirits, ways of understanding the world. Not that people may have literally believed, oh, the world was a giant ball of poo rolled up by a dung beetle.
Right.
People, I honestly think we do disservice to our ancestors by
I
thinking they
agree.
literally believed that.
I agree.
It was a way of understanding symbolically about the creation. And I think perhaps our understanding of a lot of those symbols has dropped away over time. We no longer have the context for it.
Right. Right.
But if you were trying to explain a thunderstorm to someone who had never experienced one, and you went, imagine a great warrior smashing something in the sky, and then from that, a giant bolt of light. And thus you go, so if I'm going to explain this, I'll make a whole set of stories about Thor.
Yeah.
Not that you actually think that Thor is this person in the cloud,
Right.
but it's a way of symbolically representing that aspect of nature.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
I think they
but
understood metaphors better than we do today.
I, yeah, I think there's an element of modern blindness to,
Literalism, I think. Yeah.
well, no, but I was going to say to the fact that people in the past were not stupid, nor were they any more nor any less credulous than ourselves.
Right.
That the human brain pretty much has remained relatively constant for quite some time. But
Yeah.
all of this was to say that that was one of the attractions I found in fantasy, that it was a removal from what was around me on a day-to-day basis, and
Yeah.
those tragedies that we saw and experienced. And
Yeah.
that's a level of escapism. Um,
Yeah.
but it was something that drew me to it. But I still had a love of science fiction. I still read science fiction.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, that's kind of how I started out. And then when it came to choosing um, something to do at university,
Yeah.
I had that practical ringing in my ears of, well, what are you going to do with an English degree?
Right.
So I studied law.
And you loved it.
There are I will never be sorry that I studied
Yeah.
it.
Well,
Again,
I think studying law actually is really good preparation for literary analysis. And I,
and literary analysis is really good preparation for law.
yeah,
That the skills for a significant proportion of a law degree
yeah,
are identical to the skills necessary for an English degree, and I would imagine
yeah,
for a lot of, say, history degrees, and a lot of degrees that focus on that analysis of large chunks of text, the understanding and assimilation of that information
yeah,
from large swathes of text that you have to be able to access, to be able to critically think, to reconstruct meaning and understanding, and then argument based on that,
yeah,
to isolate flaws and weaknesses and strengths in something. Um, those are common techniques across so many humanities subjects.
yeah,
And just because the subject matter changes doesn't necessarily mean that all of the skills change. And I think it was the University of Glasgow offered a course where they were studying Harry Potter. And people were ridiculing this, going,
Mhm.
oh, studying a kid's book. And you go,
I think I remember this. Yeah, yeah,
well, for a start, it's not about teaching them the world of Harry Potter. You're using Harry Potter
yes,
as a series of novels to pick up on things like the social commentary that's in it, the politics that are in it, the use of different literary techniques that are in it, how it appeals to adults as well as to children. How is that being done? How is that being managed? Applying different critical lenses to the work, because that then teaches your students how to use different critical lenses at different points
yeah,
and to switch between them, that a text can be mutable to a certain degree, and how to manipulate that. That's part and parcel of what you do on a course. It's not just
yeah,
we I think we sometimes make the mistake of, we would say things like, oh, I'm teaching Beowulf.
right.
And you go, yeah, on the one hand, yes, you are teaching Beowulf. But a huge chunk of that class is actually about these skills that you're using Beowulf to teach skills.
Critical thinking. Yeah, yeah,
Um,
analysis. Yeah.
and I think that's sometimes what, as literature academics, we sometimes mess up. We forget
Oh yeah.
that people don't understand that.
Yeah.
That people go, oh well, you're just teaching fantasy. What use is fantasy? And you go, well, okay, it's easy single case use. We are absolutely inundated by narrative in the form of news. And we have, say, left leaning outlets, right leaning outlets. We have stuff being published online that we don't necessarily know who wrote it or why they wrote it.
Yep.
And so, quite frequently, you're reading these things and you go, well, either you can just be absolutely literal and read every single word on that page and go, well, that must be the truth. Or you apply a lot of your critical thinking that you learn about picking up from context clues, about understanding when there is something there that is sticking out. How did they make me think that that person was a bad guy in this fantasy novel,
Mm.
which doesn't have any of the usual signifiers that we would have in our world? How did they do it? Oh, they were using this sort of language. Looking at this news broadcast, that's interesting that that same language is being used. It's the
Yeah.
same technique.
Yeah.
And fantasy, because it is set in quite often a world that is radically different from ours. You have fantasy language, which obscures the usual reference that we have. That
Hmm.
it plays around with language that way. That you're slightly defamiliarized.
Yeah.
That now, if you can learn to decode fantasy and understand what's happening on that page, reading a news story becomes effortless. That you're looking through it and you can see, oh, it's very interesting that your headline says X because your very next paragraph actually disproves what you've said there, because the headline is implying X. The actual facts you would have to interpret in a specific way to make that headline true. That you are skewing so heavily towards, say, a partisan belief or reportage of this event.
Yeah.
And that critical analysis, science fiction and fantasy, and horror, those are genres, because they are outside of realist fiction, that really help you, I think, at least, help you develop not only your imagination, but your ability to see past superficial language
Yep.
to what is being told, what is being pushed, why it is there. And that's part of why I was drawn to it as a subject.
Brilliant. Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. While you were studying law at Oxford, you got your degree in law. Were you able to continue reading fantasy and science fiction? Did you have time for that in your life, or was that possible for you to keep doing that?
Yeah.
You did. Okay. Because a lot of people stop reading for pleasure during their college years.
Well, I will say, when you're studying a different subject,
Yeah.
I think it's a lot easier to read for pleasure. When I was doing my PhD,
After you finished law and you did another degree in literature, then you did your PhD in
well,
fantasy.
uh, law, English, and then I did a master's in science fiction. And
Ah,
then
that's right.
then
Yeah, you did the master's, right? Where you wrote the thesis on the Sandman, right?
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
little mini dissertation on the Sandman.
Yep.
But when I was doing the PhD, and you had to read fantasy,
Yeah.
not you were choosing to read, and admittedly, it it was a burden that I had nailed to my own back. I'm not blaming anyone else. And you go, oh, it'd be absolutely amazing to study this thing that I love. And that is such a double-edged sword,
Yeah.
because it's now no longer something that you indulge when you choose to. It is now something that is your job.
Right.
This is what you are doing. You wait, it's, oh, I'm not feeling great today. I still have 2 novels to read. I still have 3 novels to read. I still have to annotate this.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you're not in the mood, you have to read.
Good
And you
job.
go,
Yeah.
and you're reading something, you go, God, this is terrible. I don't like it. Doesn't matter whether or not you like it. You have to read it. You have to know what's in the genre. You have to know the subject.
Right.
So I will say that my pleasure reading during that period dipped to the lowest I think it had ever been in my life,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because so much of the day, work wise, was spent reading.
Fantasy.
And and people would go, oh, but how can you describe reading as fantasy? And you go, right. You know, when you sit down and you go, oh, I'll read a chapter of this. This will be just to relax.
Yeah.
Now, imagine you get up in the morning, you get your coffee or your tea, and you sit at your desk and you take out a fantasy novel and a notepad, and you start reading, and you start making notes as you're reading about what genre tropes they're using.
Yeah.
What page is, oh, that's an interesting quotation about that particular theme. What page is that on? What book does that cross reference with? And you're compiling notes. You're not sitting down and reading and going, oh, this is fun. I'm just relaxing with my cup of tea. You are studying it. You are tearing it all apart. You're trying to do all of these things because you're putting together various arguments in your head for your thesis.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what I was arguing about was that this assumption that Tolkien created fantasy.
No, you're
And
talking
that is
about your PhD dissertation now.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that is a massive oversimplification. Everyone knows it's a massive oversimplification.
Yeah.
Apart from the people that honestly say, oh, well, Tolkien created modern fantasy, as if fantasy did not exist before Tolkien.
Right.
You go, no, it did. But the genre as we know it didn't exist before Tolkien. Then again, a lot of the genres as we know them didn't exist before Tolkien, but we don't claim that Tolkien invented these other things.
Right.
The publishing industry changed radically post World War II. I wonder why that would be, with all of the shortages and things that had happened during the various world wars and paper shortages. And now suddenly we had paper and time to read.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and
Um,
of course Tolkien did. I mean, the guy I wrote my dissertation on, William Morris, was writing fantasy. They were calling it prose romances, but in the 1890s. So, yeah.
and it's the same with science fiction. That people go, oh, science fiction was this time period. You go, well, what about planetary romances?
Mm.
What about the space operas? Um, Hugo Gernsback talked about science fiction was how he tried to coin the term,
Huh.
which is, it just feels like slightly awkward. But he was very into the Gadgeteer stories.
Okay.
He has, and he the Hugo is named after Hugo Gernsback,
Oh,
um,
okay.
and he was natively Luxembourgish, but was an American. He had moved to America and was a publisher in the US, and
Okay. Huh.
massively influential on the formation of science fiction and also fantasy, because you had a lot of those strange, weird stories.
Yeah,
Because fantasy as a genre hadn't really coalesced, but fantasy stories still existed.
of course. Yeah. So we
And
could go ahead. You
oh,
finish your thought, and then I want to bring you somewhere else.
okay, but and so looking back on all of those things, we can see these influences. And even if you take something like the Lost Land stories, where it's or the Hollow Earth stories, where they journey to this forgotten place. If you think in conjunction of the time period when they were written, it was about a world that hadn't been discovered yet. It was about a land that hadn't been discovered. But once you've mapped the entire globe, where are you setting those stories? And it's natural then to set them on other planets
Mm.
or in these fantasy worlds. And secondary world fantasy, there's no, I don't think this is a surprise that secondary world fantasy sort of comes after like setting a lot of this stuff on other planets. That you go, oh, if we can set them on other planets with these different rules, why can't we do a fantasy version of the same thing? That the cauldron of story that all of these different authors were drawing from is not as neatly delineated as a lot of genre discussion seems to try to make it. That
Right.
science fiction and fantasy share an incredible amount, even if they do certain things different ways, and even if they have slightly different flavors to them. But there's a lot of crossover.
Cool. Well, a couple of things we just touched on a little bit, and I want to go back to in a little more thorough way, if you don't mind. I would love for you, and I'm sure my viewers would also love to hear a little bit more about these two major projects of yours where you're contributing to our collective understanding of what a genre that we love. When you wrote I'd love to hear a little bit more about your master's thesis on the Sandman. And then after that, we could talk a little bit about the PhD dissertation, where I know a fair amount about it, but if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about it, I think it would be so wonderful. I know that it's about the influence of role-playing games on the fantasy genre, et cetera, but I think people would find it fascinating to hear about both of them. What did you do with the Sandman exactly?
Well, this is no disservice to the program I was on. I was on a science fiction program. We were studying, it was a master's in science fiction. But because of that, I'd really wanted to do fantasy. I'd wanted to do a master's in fantasy, and they didn't offer one. They had one in science fiction. So I had to do science fiction. But one of the lecturers was a narratologist. He had a structuralist and narratology. That's what he liked. And he was the first person to introduce me to that. And there was another lecturer later on, Peter Wright at Edge Hill University, who, if anyone is to blame for me falling in love with narratology, it's entirely Peter Wright's fault. And he understands this stuff far better than I ever will.
Okay.
I'm not a narratologist. I use narrative theory I play with it. I dabble in it.
Hmm.
These academics who have studied it, who use it, who routinely deploy it, they are narratologists.
Hmm.
What I do, I've always been a generalist. You learn these different theories, these different lenses, these different approaches. You start digging into them a little so you get a handle on them. And then you start deploying them because my favorite thing had always been teaching.
Hmm.
And quite often the more advanced theory stuff is for grad school.
Yeah.
But teaching focuses a lot more on those primary skills. And therefore, doing some research into narratology was all that you ever needed because you understood that. And then you find narratologists who you enjoyed reading for fun, like Gerard Genette.
Uh-huh.
I highly recommend reading Gerard Genette's books because he has a sense of humor, which not every literary theorist does.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. It sounds like almost um, what's that thing when you put two things that don't go together? Oxymoron. Yeah.
Academics and sartorial elegance. But because of studying science fiction, then one of the things that they tried to do was they introduced us to science fiction in film,
Uh-huh.
and they brought in Peter Wright from Edge Hill to teach us a lot of this stuff because he also was a film specialist,
Okay.
and because he had a specialism in science fiction and in film, he started going over a lot of the techniques used in narrative in film, and this really piqued my interest because it wasn't just about literary criticism anymore. It was about understanding story,
Mm.
narrative as a thing that existed outside of medium. And that depending on medium, similar techniques could be used, but they had slightly different effects. And that I became incredibly curious about that,
Mm.
fascinated by it because I loved. We watched something and it was a Sean, I think it was a Sean Connery film. Was it maybe called Outland or Outlander or something, where he plays a space sheriff, and clearly it was a western. You could see it was a western. It
Yeah.
was about the sheriff going out to the outpost, and there was the smuggling ring, but it was basically the bad guys, and the sheriff had to take them down. You go, that is a western, but it was set in space. It was science fiction. You go, how can it be both science fiction and a western? Because it was using all of the narrative from the narrative tricks and structures from a western, but was dressing them up in science fiction clothing. It
Yep.
was a western in a spacesuit, essentially. So I got really interested in how comic books did this
Mm.
because there's a medium that is both using the written word, but also using images.
Yeah.
And again, it varied from here is a depiction of the scene to using the actual image itself to tell story. It wasn't this is what is happening and just showing it to you. In the same way that we have seen with literature, that sometimes there's a sentence and you go, right, the sentence is saying X, but it is also implying Y.
Mm-hmm.
And I went back, a number of different comics and graphic novels and series that I liked. But Neil Gaiman's The Sandman was the one that I thought lent itself best to this because of a lot of the literary allusions in it.
Oh,
And
okay.
the A Midsummer Night's Dream happened to be one of the ones that I picked, particularly because there was the breakdown of the diegetic levels at the end. The character, spoiler for A Midsummer Night's Dream, that was published what in the mid 90s, early 90s, but Puck at the end gives his famous speech from partway through A Midsummer Night's Dream, but he gives it at the very end, and he throws down, he discards the mask. He turns in frame, so he is looking directly at the reader. And then the image gets closer and closer until he disappears and he has escaped the pages of the comic book into our world.
Yeah.
And so there was all of this about how, and that was Charles Vess illustrated it, Neil Gaiman wrote it. And forgive me, I've forgotten who inked it and who lettered it. But it was looking at how Vess not only illustrated the scene, but used how he illustrated it to tell another story.
Wow. I do have to correct you on one thing. And Midsummer Night's Dream was actually published in the early 17th century.
Oh, right. I didn't realize that Neil Gaiman's A Midsummer Night's Dream was published then. Interestingly enough, on that issue of The Sandman, it actually said additional material supplied by William Shakespeare.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Okay.
The acknowledgements to Shakespeare is actually right there, which
Yeah.
was just such a wonderful touch. But it starred, like it has Oberon and Titania in it. It has the fairy from A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yeah.
So there was a story within a story within a story kind of thing going on. This intricate form of so almost like a fractalized storytelling technique,
Yeah.
which I absolutely adored. Like I was looking at it going, I want to unpick all the different levels of this.
Yeah. Well, the whole thing about facing the character facing the audience and directly addressing them, that's right in Shakespeare too, right? So yeah.
And with that transition, everything else fades out. So it's just his eyes, and then his eyes disappear. And so you go, where has he gone? And of course, like later on in the series, you find out that Puck actually never went back to Fairy. He stayed in ostensibly our world in the story. So it's him escaping from the comic book into our world. That all of it tied together, like thematically, narratively. It was really, really clever stuff. So that sparked my interest in narrative outside of just doing a structural analysis of X or a feminist analysis of Y or a post-colonial analysis of. I went, no, I'm actually interested in story. I'm interested in narrative itself, which led me down that rabbit hole.
Okay, so cool. So from there, you did do a PhD, and that involves a much larger project, a book essentially. You wrote a book about the influence, and correct me if I got this in any way wrong or if I'm missing something important here, but and I want you to elaborate, obviously, but it's basically the main topic area is the influence of role-playing games on the development of the fantasy genre as an explanation of no, fantasy isn't just post-Tolkien. There's a lot of stuff going on in fantasy that's to do with the influence of role-playing games, correct?
Yeah, and that's simply it. When we locate fantasy in and around Tolkien, it's not only what we've always been told, and you sort of go, but fantasy didn't exist before Tolkien. And you go, well, actually it did.
Yeah.
We all know fantasy existed before Tolkien. It mightn't have been called fantasy. It might have had various different elements to it, or it might have been framed a different way. But we know fantasy existed before Tolkien. Like, no one is denying that. So why do we keep saying that fantasy is, Tolkien created the fantasy genre? There's a whole lot of things feed into that, but not the least of which are the number of authors who refer to Tolkien as, like us, the quite often the person that got them into fantasy or showed them what you could do with fantasy when science fiction was already doing it. But you could do it for fantasy, and it didn't have to be for children. That you could treat it as grown up, and it, in some respects, it was because they read Lord of the Rings, because the Lord of the Rings was a cultural phenomenon, became massively popular. Right. The fact that there was a movement in the States where it was people were buying little badges that said Frodo lives on it.
Right. Yeah. Or Gandalf for president or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, like it was, and it tied into the counterculture and a whole lot of stuff in the States. So it became phenomenally popular. And like all of these things, when it attains that level of popularity, it has an impact. But when we think about the structures inherent in how storytelling in the genre typically works, in the 90s, while there are still some, like Robert Jordan, following in Tolkien's footsteps, but you can see that Jordan very quickly starts to move away from a lot of
after the first book in Wheel of Time, after Eye of the World,
But even tonally, it's not the same. Like you don't. While there are narrative events in Eye of the World that are very, very similar, tonally it doesn't have the same resonance that the Fellowship of the Ring has. They feel very, very different. And it's not just that it's an Americanized Lord of the Rings. It's it actually has a different ethos at the heart of it. It has a different feeling at the heart of it. It is more of an adventure story. In fact, it's a lot closer to what Peter Jackson did in the adaptation of Lord of the Rings,
Mm-hmm.
turning the Lord of the Rings more into action adventure. That, when you look at it from that point of view,
Hmm.
Jordan's book looks a lot more like that. It's the action adventure version of the Lord of the Rings.
You could say the same of the Sword of Shannara, by Terry Brooks.
And a lot of this, I was going, well, a lot of it can be explained by the rise in popularity of role playing games. The instances of wizards who actively cast fireballs and lightning spells and do those things. There was a significant spike in that sort of very active spell effect in the late 80s and early 90s. Before that, while there are instances of it, it is far less prevalent.
Well, Gandalf never, yeah. I mean, look, what does Gandalf do magic wise,
Yeah, he lights a couple of acorns. He makes the waters at the Ford of Bruin appear to have horses on them because he's frosting Elrond's cake. He has the power of speech and persuasion, word magic, to inspire. Now, if you think of Earthsea, how much of that is tied into language as magic, language as power?
Oh, it's intimately tied. Yeah.
And that style of magic is much more prevalent in a lot of the earlier works. That the naming of things having power, but the idea of it being an active magic system, like we all use the term magic system now.
Yeah.
You go, that comes from role-playing games. They weren't systems before this. And I then wanted to make the argument, whether or not people felt it was persuasive, but that Tolkien was one of the major touchstones that shaped fantasy as we understand it. But after Tolkien, role-playing games, we can localize it around that, be it if it was specifically D&D or if in the computer game variants that followed it. Because in any given year, you might have had one or two Dragonlance books, 2 or 3 Forgotten Realms books, a Ravenloft book, a Greyhawk book, and that's just the D&D franchises. Compared to, there was that one by Jordan. One Jordan book to 7 or 10 or 14 role-playing game-based books.
Wow. Yeah.
Because they were marketed not just by the author, like R.A. Salvatore's Icewind Dale and R.A. Salvatore's was Homeland and Sojourn and Exile. I can't remember the name of the trilogy, but the Drizzt books.
Right.
They were Forgotten Realms books. Douglas Niles did the Moonshade trilogy. And so you had the Moonshade trilogy, the Drizzt books, the Dragonlance books were huge. And because they were games, they were associated with games. There were then computer game variants. And you had like Eye of the Beholder on, might have been the Commodore Amiga, or even probably it was after the Commodore 64. It was probably the Commodore Amiga. But really early computer games, because so much of it lent itself to being able to be calculated by a computer because it was all mathematical calculations.
Yeah.
And so we started getting nerds who were into computers, nerds who were into science fiction, nerds who were into fantasy. There's a common denominator there of nerddom.
Yep.
And it was all sort of coming together. And when you think of how large and how important the computer game industry is, and you sort of go, well, I don't play computer games, it doesn't affect me. At its height, World of Warcraft had well over 10 million monthly subscribers.
Wow.
Some of the smaller, massively multiplayer online role-playing games, the smaller ones, 3.5 million monthly subscribers. That's one of the small ones.
So let me ask you this. In addition to the hundreds of books you read for this project, did your research also entail playing role-playing games?
No. I had some experience of it from my past. Obviously, a lot of it had to do, I read up on a lot of role-playing because, believe it or not, there's an entire field of academic study of ludology, the study of games.
Yep.
Ludic, Ludo. Ludo just means game. But ludology, they studied this, and it is always evolving. And it's interesting that academics take one approach. In ludology, sometimes they look at it from a psychoanalytical or a sociological, sometimes from a gaming mechanic perspective. There are all these different ways of looking at it, and no one is ever satisfied with someone else's approach. But for me, it was so wonderful because I was seeing how these different mechanics, how the creation of narrative, be it cooperative or antagonistic in these games, how that was being played out, what was being agreed, how it was being understood. And seeing then with like my own, this was what I lived through, was the rise of the computer game, the rise of the franchise novel. The franchise novels weren't the norm back in the day.
Right, right.
Even if we described a fantasy series, that is a relatively, well, now it's no longer modern, but at the time it was a relatively modern phenomenon, because before that, oh yeah, sure, a fantasy trilogy, but a trilogy isn't a series; it's a closed narrative system.
Yeah.
It's a complete narrative told in 3 volumes. That's how we think of it. But a series, you can have an ongoing series, like the Dresden Files, and that has more to do with a lot of television storytelling, serialized narratives, which is going back again, not only television, but going back to the heyday of science fiction and fantasy serialized stories in the various fanzines and magazines.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and of course we could mention your friend Mr. Erickson's The Malazan Book of the Fallen as a series as well. But wouldn't it be great to be able to tell people when they ask you, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a ludologist, right? And they'd be like, what's that? And they'd be like, well, I play games. Yeah.
I spend a lot of time rolling dice. But so it was the point of the PhD was to challenge the assumption that Tolkien was still the heart of the genre.
Yeah.
Because the more fantasy I was reading, the less that it resembled Tolkien. And the more it resembled aspects of things that I saw in role-playing games.
Yeah.
The various class systems, the formation of the party. Like take party formation. I think we've mentioned this before. But if you were writing a quest novel and you went, right, I'm going to have 4 halflings in it who can't do anything.
Except get carried around. Yeah.
And then 3 warriors and 1 archer and 1 mage. And people go, well, that seems a little unbalanced. It doesn't seem flexible enough. And when we think of a lot of the quest groups that we see, we can apply the term balance to it. They're a lot more balanced. There tends to be like 1 or 2 magic users, someone who is an archer of some kind of sort of a distance, then someone else who's a close-up fighting specialist, someone who's very burly who can protect other people who are offensive and who do damage. And you go, yeah, that's all from gaming. Damage per second, that's your DPS. That's the guy who inflicts a lot of damage, but mightn't be very tough. You have your wizard who's a glass cannon. They can fire huge amounts of damage, but they need to be protected while they wind up to deliver it, and then while they recover to do the next one. You have your big burly guy who's going to protect them all. You have all of these archetypes, and the archetypes, yes, were drawn from all these different stories. Again, from different time periods, not just Tolkien, but they were drawn from all of them, and they were put in the same place. They were put on the same serving tray of the narrative techniques and narrative elements, and went, here is what you're choosing from, rather than here's Tolkien, this is what you're choosing from.
Right.
Like, no, it went in a different direction. And I think a lot of the elements of modern fantasy lent into that, not necessarily more realist, but more literal and materialist approach
Yeah.
to fantasy. The idea of having mechanics, the idea of not just creating verisimilitude and an authentic experience within a world that could have whimsy, but going, no, this is going to be a planet. And if it's a planet, I have to make sure that X and Y and Z works. Because Tolkien didn't worry about that. Like, for all that Tolkien was concerned with details, he didn't worry that it was a functioning planet, because otherwise it wouldn't have started out as a flat Earth and then became a globe. You're like, Right. That's a okay.
We're talking total mythology there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Interesting.
mythopoeism.
Yep. Interesting though how you mentioned materialism, and I think that the two things are related, perhaps. But what people keep referring to these days is grimdark. Also, I think there's a more emphasis on materialism, perhaps, in grimdark as well.
I also part of it I think is a misremembering of
Mm,
heroic stories. And people always complain, "Oh, I hate those stories where there's the absolute paragon of virtue, good guy." Yeah,
mm,
name 10.
yeah.
If there are so many of them, list 10 really famous ones where you have like the and when they start talking, you go, right. It's actually more difficult than you think. It's a bit like when people talk about, oh, that stereotype of the blonde, blue-eyed farm boy going on a quest.
Yep.
Not that many. Quite often they have dark hair and dark eyes,
Yeah. Yeah.
surprisingly enough. Or all fantasy books have a map at the start. I know an academic who has written a book proving that the majority of fantasy books do not have a map at the start.
They don't.
No,
No.
he did. He did research into this because we were fascinated by these assumptions being made
I
about
would have
fantasy.
thought, yeah, definitely a majority, not all, but I would have thought a majority of fantasy books would have a map. And no, okay.
No, I mean, I remember I sat down in the fantasy archive or in the science fiction and fantasy archive because he had emailed me and I was going through each book and I noted down the title, the author, the edition, and then noted whether or not it had maps.
Huh.
And I went through row after row after, and then, sent him the list because he was going, no, it was an assumption we all had because Tolkien had maps.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's so interesting. Huh. Huh.
But, I suppose I could start randomly picking things off the shelf.
Yeah.
But it's weird that, and then suddenly it'll become in vogue again, and yes, there will be maps, and then it'll go through. No, we don't want maps. Like everything, our prologues. Oh, prologue. Fantasy always has prologues, except when it doesn't.
Yep. Yep.
Oh,
Yep.
you can't have prologues except when you can. It goes through cycles, and that's the thing when we make assumptions about a genre, how
Yeah.
we're defining it, the time period that we're defining it in, all those things come into play. But sorry, I forgot your question.
I forgot my question. It's okay. I mean, I asked you to talk about your dissertation, and this is fantastic. This is perfect. Not
But
no pun
it's
intended with fantastic there. I mean the other way.
um, but that was part and parcel of it. It wasn't to say that Tolkien was unimportant because Tolkien clearly
Right.
had a really massive influence on the formation of D&D. But then you would say, oh well, okay. Say Dunsany had a huge influence on that writer, or Morris had a huge influence on that writer, or
Right.
just because they had an influence on them doesn't mean that you attribute it to that, particularly if they do something different. But you had mentioned Grimdark, and one of the interesting things about Grimdark, and Ralph Blutax mentioned this in a brilliant discussion of the origin of the term Grimdark and all this sort of stuff, was it was a tongue-in-cheek exaggeration that was used in Warhammer 40k. And I remember 40k back when it was the Rogue Trader tabletop RPG rules, before it was a tabletop war game.
Right.
I had Rogue Trader. Um, before anyone questions my credentials in this one, because
Whoa.
again, how can you be a true fan? Go away. But uh, they seem to locate it and go, but 40k did it. And go, but 40k was heavily influenced by 2000 AD, the comic book,
Hmm.
which had horror stories in it, that had science fiction stories in it, with a very dark bent. Judge Dredd being one of the main ones, a massive influence. This dark, gritty, at best, anti-hero, this fascistic hero, or anti-hero, Judge Dredd, that he wasn't heroic. He was judge, jury, and executioner for petty criminals. Oh, you littered. That's 10 years in isolation. But I dropped a candy wrapper. Yes. You have now confessed, but I don't want to go. You're resisting arrest. Bang. But a lot of this, if you think of the time period of a lot of these stories, it was part and parcel of the Thatcherite era. A lot of the strikes in England, a lot of economic depression,
Hmm.
that there was anger brimming under the surface. And I think sometimes when things like that happen, that it bleeds into our literature that it was an outlet for releasing this anger for writers.
Mm,
And David Gemmell wrote Legend and the Draenei books.
yeah.
And again, it's heroic fantasy, but with a much darker edge than Tolkien. Because again, Moorcock, with his Elric stuff, he was writing horror tinged fantasy
Mm,
and science fiction, and didn't want to be limited by the sort of the conservative, small c conservative idols that of the English countryside that Tolkien seemed to be going on about. That this was a modern, more industrial age. This was I live in a red brick terraced house in the middle of an industrial estate in an English manufacturing city. I
yeah.
don't live in a quaint little cottage in the countryside where it's sunshiny during the day and I can frolic through the fields.
It's hard to
But,
frolic when there's all that grit around, right? Yeah.
so um, a lot of, or at least some of that movement towards a darker edged fantasy, I think, was happening with some of the English writing. And we saw it even in comic books
Mm,
with Frank Miller writing those darker Batman stories.
yeah. I was just thinking that.
That,
Yeah.
but we also had at that time, which you can't discount, the rise of the 80s action movie.
Hmm.
And I think, that's where people, I think, get a lot of their hero iconography from, the 80s action movies rather than actual fantasy. But
Yeah.
that rise in violence, that cartoonish action violence, when it was then placed in a fantasy world, it was getting darker. It was getting the ramifications of it. It was the psychological impact of it. It was getting more visceral. And when you become numb or inured or used to a certain level of violence on television and in film, how do you up the ante, particularly with something that's non-visual, non-visceral, the way that writing is?
Right.
You make it darker, you make it more violent. And we saw that whole increase. But that mirrors what Robert E. Howard did in the early 20th century, that he was
Mhm.
writing stuff that was far more violent and aggressive and angry than a lot of his contemporaries. That's where we got King Kull and Conan and those stories.
Yeah.
And we see a similar sort of thing here where you have that destabilized social environment. And part of, I think, the response to that sometimes is the desire to write angry or visceral stories that are trying to get across that anger, and a desire to read them as a way to cathartically sort of respond with your own anger.
Yeah. Well, you and I are going to be reading Gemmell's Legend very soon and discussing it. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And there's a fun story behind that too. The fact that we're going to be reading Legend together. I think, very first comment from you when I had my channel was fairly new, was on the video I made about the origins and development of the fantasy genre. And it's a 15, 17-minute video. So obviously I'm not going to cover everything there. And I had this little pinned comment saying, all right, guys, I know I left out a lot of things. What things did I forget that you would mention? And then this guy, AP Canavan, leaves this comment here, and very nice comment, saying nice things. And then I think you left out a couple important things, though. One is the D&D. And I was like, yeah, I know. I actually knew already I'd left out D&D. That was kind of like a big oversight. And then the other was, you talked about, you were talking now, you talked about Grimdark, but you failed to mention David Gemmell. And I think you should probably, and we got into a little exchange, and you invited me to have a further discussion about Gemmell. And so now here we are, a little bit
Philip,
later.
I have apologized for that comment so many times. And on the
Oh, you
one
don't have
hand,
to apologize.
I know, but on the one hand, yeah, I was being a snarky, uppity person going, you didn't say it. On the other hand, because of that comment,
Yeah,
I have gotten to know you. We have gotten to have so many amazing conversations, and
that's right.
I've
Yeah.
gotten to call you a friend. And so I can't fully apologize for that, because the ramification for it has been a genuine and wonderful, surprising friendship that I have been very grateful to be part of.
Oh,
Uh,
it's it is the biggest blessing of me starting a channel. It really has been wonderful. And I don't want you to apologize at all for it. First of all, you were right. I mean, it was a great comment. And I figured, this guy knows what he's talking about, I think maybe he's an academic. And I turned out to be right. And as you say, that was the beginning of something beautiful. So I'm absolutely no apology necessary. Good grief. Yeah.
But it's interesting when you try to define what fantasy is,
Yeah.
and we even if we try to define where it came from, like, fantasy is not the same as mythology. Like,
No, it's not. Okay, so the mythology, first of all, is collective, right? There's a collective value to mythology that lots of people, these are shared stories, they're communal
they're
stories,
communal stories, but
right?
also formulated for the oral storytelling tradition. The
Yes,
vast majority of mythologies were oral storytelling. So they actually use different narrative techniques,
right,
and they're framed in different ways, and
right.
they are to be interpreted and consumed in different ways.
Yeah,
They contain fantastic elements,
yes.
but so do animal fables. Are we saying that animal fables are fantasy?
Mm.
How much? How are we using fantasy then? And what we have a tendency to do is we expand the term fantasy to mean anything non-mimetic, anything non-realist. You go, oh, it's not the real world, therefore it is part of fantasy. So fantasy becomes a super genre that encompasses science fiction, the genre of fantasy, horror, all aspects of magic realism, mythology, religion, and you start to add everything. You go, well, it's not a useful definition anymore. And it's anytime
Right.
someone goes, this is the very first fantasy text. And you go, well, for a start, it probably isn't. Even if you go back,
Unless you're talking about Gilgamesh.
but even then, it's the first one that we have recovered, but
Yes.
Gilgamesh wasn't written as a fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, or was it? I don't know. I
We
mean,
don't know. It could have been a mythology. It could have been a religion. It could have been
right.
a fable, not necessarily fantasy. It
Hmm.
contains what we now consider fantastic elements, but that's not necessarily how it was thought of at the time. It's the same way that people point
Oh,
to Mary
but
Shelley's,
the author's dead, so don't worry about it.
but people point to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and they go, "This is clearly the first work of science fiction." And you go,
Ah,
"Why?" Oh, because Dr. Frankenstein creates the monster using electricity. And you go,
that's
"Really?
yeah.
Where does it say he used electricity?"
Oh, yeah, and
He
they were,
went he
yeah.
went to the exhibition and saw electricity making the dead frog move, and then went back and was performing experiments. But the other thing that he was looking at were alchemical texts,
Right, right, right.
and he comes up with a system that no one else has come up with. So is Shelley not implying that he some way combined ancient mysticism and modern technology?
Hmm.
So that is both science and magic. So it's not clear cut science fiction unless we go, oh, but thematically it's doing this thing. You also, it's a lot of allegory and metaphor and symbolism.
Hmm.
That's how you're now defining science fiction. There's a very strong argument that has been made by a number of scholars, and then people just repeat. But they built a very strong argument for Shelley's Frankenstein to be the first sort of text for science fiction. But you still have what was that one? It's the journey to the fantastic journeys. It's an ancient Greek one where he goes to the moon, and so he visits the moon, and there are these weird alien creatures on the moon, and you go, well, why is that considered fantasy and not science fiction? He
Yeah.
travels in a ship to the moon, to an extra planetary body. He goes to the moon that's
Hmm.
orbiting this via ship, traveling, and there are aliens there. They aren't magic monsters; they are alien.
Hmm.
Why is that not the first science fiction?
Yeah.
And because it all depends on how you define things, which goes back to how I ended up doing the PhD in the first place, which is the assumptions being made. And when you're challenged with, oh well, it doesn't fit that, the bending and the sort of twisting that we had to do with interpretation so that it would match Tolkien again. And you end up distending and distorting your reading of Tolkien
Yeah.
in order to make it fit with what the genre is doing.
Very cool. Wow.
Uh,
Well, you've told the story enough times and it's a wonderful story. And I'd encourage people to watch the videos on your channel where you've talked about this, how you became a developmental editor or advanced reader, I guess is what we call you in that context, for Steven Erikson and Ian Esselmont. I think it's just fantastic. Obviously, they trust you enough to, and it's a funny story because it all begins with sort of an accident with you having the wrong Steve. Steven Donaldson, Steven Erikson. Yeah.
And they were both there, and neither one of them was wearing name tags.
Yep. Yep. Oops. I don't. I'll have to find which video you've talked about that in, so I can link it for people. It's a wonderful story. But go ahead.
Well, I was about to say it's a funny story, but also it's something that I am ready to admit that I make mistakes. I'm only human. I'm only fallible, and it is funny that that mistake ended up having such an impact on my life. It was a happy accident.
Yeah.
And it has led to enormous opportunities, a lot of fun projects that I was involved in that never took off, that never went anywhere. But they were so interesting to do, and I learned a lot from them. And it set me down the path to becoming an editor and doing this freelance. Because before then, I was an academic and I taught, but I wasn't thinking of a career being a freelance editor.
Yeah.
Because that you're set on your path. I'm going to be an academic. I'm going to teach, and I'm going to write articles, and I'll write a monograph, and I'm going to climb up the greasy pole of academia and step on everyone on the way there, and throw people overboard and under buses and steal their office because they have a more comfortable chair. That was that. I had planned that all out, and but part and parcel of what happened was, no, I ended up moving away from that. And because of spending a lot of time with Erikson, with Esselmont, with other authors, I realized that sometimes as academics, as literature academics, because we are so used to working on texts written by people who have long since passed away, we forget how useful a source is when we can still access them.
Oh my goodness.
Authors are an incredible resource for academics. And, in part, the whole death of the author thing, it's a lot more complicated than this, but in part, it was a justification for, we don't need the author's opinion on this because we're the ones analyzing the text, and, we can't ask Shakespeare anything. So our interpretation is the most important thing, not what some mythical form of Shakespeare would have intended. And yet, if you say to any Shakespeare scholar, we've created this time machine, and you can go back in time and you can talk to Shakespeare about the writing of Hamlet, they would knock you over in their haste to go and get those questions answered. And the reader will have their own interpretation. The text is always the narrative from the text is created and understood in the mind of a reader. But authorial intent, the author, these books were not created out of thin air.
Right.
Someone crafted it. Someone had what they were trying to tell you. And understanding that does not take away from what you understood. You may have understood something different, fine. But just because you now know that the author intended something else, it now gives you almost like a fracture point. You can look at it and go, if the author intended X and I understood Y, how did that happen? What happened in that section that I got a different meaning than the author? And suddenly you get an insight into how these things are communicated. But this insistence that anything I read and how I read it is right. No, it's not. People misread all the time. Look at the number of reviews of modern films where people are wittering on about a modern film and they go, and it clearly says this thing. And you go, no, it doesn't. It doesn't clearly say that thing. In fact, that is directly contradicted by various elements of the film, here, here, and here. Well, that's what I got from it, so that's what it means. You go, no, that's what you misinterpreted because you are discounting that information. You have misread. You have misunderstood.
Wait, you mean the viewer / reader is not always right?
Well, unless of course they're me, which is clearly untrue. I am always happy to admit that, yeah, I make mistakes. I'm a flawed human being. I do my best. But this assumption of the valid reader experience has now been exaggerated to what you read is therefore perfectly valid. You not necessarily.
Hmm.
And by valid, yes, you experience that, fine. But that's not the same as it being right.
But you're in this unique position too. Well, not unique, but you're in the position of being a critic, a developmental editor. Obviously, you're kind of like a midwife there, aren't you, in a way? Helping stories be born, right? I mean, there must be some, you don't like that metaphor?
Well, I don't get my hands as dirty for a start. And I think sitting at a desk at a laptop with a keyboard is a lot more comfortable. But you understand this
Yeah.
as now an author, but also as an academic, studying a text and then explaining it to a student. And the student has read the text
Yeah.
and they come up with some wild, and you go, where did you get that from? Well, that's what you said. And you go, only if you remove 90% of the words that I said before and after those five.
Yeah. Yeah.
Taking things out of context, misreading things, misunderstanding things. But this is so commonplace. You ask any educator,
Mm.
and you will have students say, "But that's not what you said." And you go, "What did I say?" And they go, "You said that all blah blah blah." And you go, "That's not what I said. I said some, not all. I said this, not that." And you can go back over it, and they go, "Well, that's not what I heard."
Mm. Well, that's true.
Clearly.
Yeah.
And if that's when someone is listening to something that they are taking notes as you are speaking, imagine what it's like when you're not taking notes, that you're just casually reading something. Of
Yeah.
course you misread. Of course you misunderstand. Of course you misinterpret. To assume otherwise is to pretend that you're omniscient.
Right.
And, I like even my arrogance doesn't extend that far. Um, but this is the thing. It's we live a lot of us live in cultures that have hyper fixated on the aggrandizement of the individual. The customer is always right.
Right.
That's the old saying. You go, no, it isn't.
Actually, there's a piece missing there.
In matters of taste and preference, the customer is always right, was the saying. Do you
Yeah.
notice how, well, that's basically the same thing? No, no, it's not. One is saying that you're infallible. The other is saying that, yes, you know what your tastes are.
Right.
They're different things. But we see this all the time. The uh, individualism being at the heart of everything about,
Mm-hmm.
well, that didn't meet my expectations. Yes, but your expectations were wildly inaccurate. No one could have met those expectations. Like,
Yeah.
you watched this trailer and you thought that this was going to be a tragedy. What's wrong? But that's what I expected. Just because you have expectations doesn't mean that those expectations are based in reality or that they're even reasonable expectations to have. But
Yeah.
but we talk about it as, well, it didn't meet my expectations, as if that's the film's fault. When you go, well, yeah, that's because your expectations were wrong for
Mm.
what the thing was. But we never think of criticizing ourselves. It's always the other thing's fault.
Mm.
Um,
So how do you, I mean, it's so interesting, and I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but how do you reconcile what you were just saying with the fact that you yourself have written critical essays? You are a critic. That is one of your titles, right? I mean, the whole character of Apto Canavalian is based on you as a critic. Uh,
allegedly.
allegedly. It's pretty much a biography, I think, that Erickson wrote. But anyway. But anyway, how do you then, okay, so as a critic, what's the difference between somebody saying, and there is an answer to this, there's an intelligent answer to this, but what's the difference between someone saying, well, it didn't meet my expectations, and a critic who sits down and writes say a review of a film?
Right. Um, let's say you and I read a book and David Gemmell's Legend, and you go, I didn't enjoy that. Does that mean it's a bad book?
No.
Does it mean it's badly written?
Nope.
And you go, right. So there's a difference between the quality of the text and whether or not you enjoyed it.
Correct.
Now, your enjoyment of it might be a symptom or an aspect of what makes a book good or bad in your eyes, but it is one aspect.
It could be I had
Then,
a flu when I read it, or any number of things too. Yeah.
yeah, you just weren't in the mood for it, and you were reading it because you had work to do, and you said, "Oh, I've said that I'm going to read this. I'm going to read this. This is the ninth book like this that I have read in a row. I'm just not engaged."
Right.
But the book, the text doesn't change, but our approach to it changes, our feelings about it. Think of a book that you read when you were a lot younger, when you were a child, and you went, "This is amazing."
Mm-hmm.
And you look at it now and go, "I was an idiot. This is terrible."
Well, I say that to myself almost every day, but yeah, I get your meaning. Yeah.
And you go, "So how did the book go from being a good book to a bad book then?" The book hasn't changed.
Hmm.
Because the book is always in a state. Our appreciation of it changes. So I think one of the reasons people talk about critics, the critics for films or books, they're always wrong, except when they agree with you. And you go, right, right. So when the critic agrees with you, they're right.
Right.
But when they disagree with you, they are wrong.
But don't disagree with the critical dragon, because you might get a fireball thrown at you.
But, and again, this is what I'm saying. Like, why is it that the critic is right or wrong depending on your point of view? And you go,
Right.
Is it possible that the critic has always been right and sometimes you're wrong? Because there's two halves to that equation.
Right.
But we assume it's the critic got it wrong. Why did the critic like that film? I thought it was terrible. And you go, you read through the critical evaluation. They go, the cinematography was actually really engaging. Some of the character work, the characterization, that was really well done. The plot was kind of pedestrian. It was kind of telegraphed. I wasn't thrilled with that. But when we look at how this theme was explored, and they go into all of these things about why they think it was good, and it's not necessarily some critics do it, some don't. But it's not necessarily that they go, "I really enjoyed this," because their enjoyment is not necessarily the metric by which something is good or bad.
They're able to separate that from their assessment.
And it can be an additional piece of information to it.
Mm-hmm.
But the number of times when critics look at things and they go, "Yeah, this is actually, this is pretty good. This is a 7 out of 10. Where you go, 10 is the best. 1 will say is the worst because you can't really give something 0. 5 is the median. So 7 is above average. And people go, "Well, I gave that 6," as if, that's really bad. You go, "That's still above average."
Yeah.
You go, "Well, I gave this 1." And we've seen that with a number of recent TV shows. Go, "Oh, this is terrible. There are no redeeming qualities." And I went, "Well, that's clearly untrue." Costuming has been good. Some of the cinematography is good. Some of the shot composition has been excellent. Some of the subtle things that they have done with foreshadowing have been really good. Some of the character work has been really interesting. You mightn't like it,
Right.
but that doesn't mean that it's not good acting or some bits of it were good. This had this thing which is bad writing, so the whole thing is bad. You go, that's a mistake. That isn't something.
And a good example, I think, is when you were watching Star Trek Discovery and really enjoying a lot of it, but every time, pretty much, I think you were able to say something positive, like, "Yes, I see they did this, but this part I would have done something." And what I really enjoyed about those videos is when you would say, "Here's what I would do to fix this," and that's really cool to see. Okay, I can make the narrative structure of this stronger by making this scene, just tweak this scene a little bit here. That's a kind of a cool critic move, I think.
And like one of the differences is it's not saying I need them to rewrite the entire thing to match the story that I want.
It's minimal, actually.
It's looking at what they have done and going, right, I have an issue with this thing. I don't think that this thing works because they have A, B, and then it jumps to F. How can I alter that sequence so it flows A, B, C, but it still arrives at F? It still convincingly flows to that point.
Right.
And how can I do it with minimal interference? Because you want to keep as much of the original narrative as you possibly can
Right.
to be true to that vision. And you want to interfere as little as possible. Because it's really easy to say, oh, they should just scrap the entire thing. Well, that doesn't fix anything. And you go, and then they should just do this story. You go, well, okay, walk me through that story. Right. You now have issues in that section, and that section, which are different to the issues that they had. Because when you create, and you know this
I mean,
from writing.
yeah. Well, you're describing what you do as a developmental editor right now. This is what you do, essentially. It's a big part of what you do, right?
It's and well, for example, in the very opening pilot of Star Trek Discovery, they have a brilliant cinematic sequence where Giorgio and Michael are walking on the plane and they form the giant delta of the Star Trek symbol because their communicators aren't working, the ship can't find them. And so they've walked in this pattern so that the people up in space looking down can see the delta. And the problem is, while that is cinematically satisfying, it's incredibly dumb. Because the conditions they show us on the planet are that these winds are coming across and erasing things, and they're leaving footprints. They're not digging a 6-foot wide trench that is 8 feet deep, so it's nice and deep and a solid black line. It's footprints, and they're showing the view from the spaceship up above that just happens to be looking down through cloud. The clouds have broken, and they can see the shape because the footprints are just going to be visible. Now,
from space,
cinematically, very, very satisfying. But because Star Trek was trying to build a verisimilitudinous reality, this is meant to be real. This is meant to be humanity's future in our universe.
It's not mythopoetic then in this case.
And therefore, you look at that and go, but that doesn't make sense with the physics of our reality, with how light works, with how these things work, with how weather works, with how dust on a planet works.
Right.
But a way that you could do almost exactly the same thing would be if they're walking across and there is a crust, which there was in this desert area, it was parched. And when they break that crust, there's bioluminescent sort of bacteria that suddenly bloom.
Oh, cool.
Then you would have them walking across and Giorgio deliberately breaking the crust each time to activate this. And Michael sort of go, why are you doing that? She goes, no reason. And then when you get back, it zooms out and you can see a glow. And because if they had changed it to then nighttime, because night shaded the planet, the glow suddenly makes it stand out.
Yeah.
But that would be a slightly different way of doing it. Does it still have problems? Yes, you shouldn't. How big do you have to make a shape that's visible from space?
Yeah.
But trying to mitigate it so it becomes that slightly tiny bit more believable without changing the scene, without changing what they're trying to do.
Right.
It's you try to do that rather than go, oh, well, they should just do something completely different. You go,
yeah.
Okay, well, I'm just going to rewrite the entire script, am I?
With the goal being to create a scene that doesn't shove the viewer out of the story by saying, wait, that doesn't make any sense. The dust was blowing. And, if you make that tiny switch, you keep your reader in the scene without breaking that immersion, right?
Yeah, and it's the same like with Iron Man 3. In Iron Man 3...
Oh, that film has so many problems.
No, but like one of the big ones is at the beginning, the extremist soldiers who were experimented on are victims. And they've been blowing it. They didn't want to blow up. And it's all about Tony investigating this and then realize that these people have been experimented on. And Killian is the bad guy. But then the director, Shane Black, by the end of it goes, no, but now we need our big action sequence. So now we're just going to have all of the extremist people try and beat them up. And the whole storyline that had been building for 2 acts about investigating how these extremist people had been made, what had been done to them, the fact that these were veterans who had served in the armed forces and had been wounded, and this was they'd been lied to about this, that they were victims, that had been built for the first 2/3 of the film. And yeah, a couple of them are bad guys who are willingly serving Killian. Yeah, sure. But the rest of them were just trying to survive. And then suddenly it's, no, they're all just glowy monsters. So the way that you could alter that is, there are different ways then that you could pick it apart and go, if you want them to be bad guys, then at the beginning, don't set them up as victims. If you want that victim narrative to go through, that Iron Man is going to save them. That whole thing at the very, very end, where in a couple of days he discovers a cure for Pepper. You go, if you shuffle that, he goes, I think I've come up with a cure. Can you formulate that? And he then gets like Jarvis to be making this and then flying it out with a suit that's trying to shoot these people so they get cured because it's been driving them mad. You suddenly you change it into like these guys then, instead of being killed, Iron Man is injecting them with a solution that they're falling to the ground. They're still in a big fight. You still have the big fighty scene.
Yeah.
But instead of killing them, he's curing them. And when they are cured, then they wake up and they're like, what happened to me? Because you could then say the extremist thing affects their mind. That depending on what way you wanted to go, those are two completely different options.
Yeah.
If you want them to be bad guys, setting them up as victims for 2/3 of the film, it's not a misdirect to send the audience the wrong way. That's a mistake in your narrative direction.
Right.
But if you want them to be victims, then switching them at the end to be villains is again not a misdirect. It's now gone in a different direction. So how do you correct it without rewriting the entire thing? You try to find those fracture points. You try to find and trace back and go, if I tweak this thing, if I make a small change here, that has ramifications all the way down the line, and it makes the thing line up.
Well, that does seem like, as a developmental editor / critic, you do go beyond just saying, I didn't enjoy that. Your client might be a little upset if that was the feedback.
book okay, send check now. Which, pretty much was what I sent to you.
Yeah, right. That's what you said.
It was like a 3-sentence email going, it's all fine. Like, don't worry about it. Here's my PayPal.
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. That's a good explanation, I think, of what a critic can do. And hopefully if somebody's still in the developing stages of their story, they get somebody like that to put their eyes on it and make it a stronger story. That's pretty much what it's about, right?
Yeah, and like one of the things that I think we sometimes forget, it's not about trying to make it the story that pleases you personally.
Right.
It's about trying to find the best way to achieve the author's vision. The author is telling this story, and you go, right, I've been picking up that you've been doing this. This doesn't fit with that. But if you did this thing or this thing or this thing, that's going to fit more in line with that, and it then will naturally flow. Regardless of whether or not I like that I like the direction that the author is going in. It's not about me going, you know what? I prefer more action in these stories. You need an action sequence here. Because it's not my job to write the story. Right. The author's job is to write the story. It's the editor's job to help the author bring it to life and polish it to the best way possible, to smooth out any potential burrs, to try and pinpoint areas that may be slightly weaker or really strong areas and go, this is a really good thing. Maybe if you did a wee bit more of this, it would shore up that section and that section. This is the kind of thing that I think really shows or shines in your story. So I think that's something you need to aim more for. But that's why when we talk about this is a 5-star book, you go, right, so you're evaluating the book. The book is good. Well, no, I just really liked it. It was a 5-star read. And you go, there's a massive difference between a 5-star read, which is about how much you enjoyed it, and a 5-star book, which is about the quality of the book.
Right. Two different things. Yeah.
They are literally two different things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't wait to talk about examples of areas of my books that I feel you really made stronger. It's going to be a lot of fun. There are particular scenes that there's some AP influence on those scenes, and I feel like they're stronger, better scenes for it. So that's going to be a lot of fun when it comes out. There's some very specific ones that make me very happy to think about. Like now I feel like, oh yeah, this scene I liked it before, but now it's like epic. I love it. I love what this is now. So yeah,
Oh, the time traveling detective scene where he takes out his laser gun, and that scene, that's the one you're talking
something like that. Yeah. Oh dear. Well, so what then? Okay, we got your academic background, and I think we talked a fair amount about being a developmental editor and a critic. Why then did you start your channel, A Critical Dragon? And this wasn't the first time you've gone by that title. You have some really, I think, fantastic reviews and essays under the title of, you have a blog or whatever you want to call it, right? A Critical Dragon. You have a link to that, right, on your channel?
I started doing the blog again because I was pressured into it because I used to have conversations with people and we would be talking about things
Yeah.
and it'd be, well, why don't you write that? Why don't you put a review out about that? And I was like, but I don't like reviewing books. I took a stab at doing Goodreads for a while and then just gave up because it was just miserable.
Okay.
I didn't enjoy it. So I took a stab at having a website. I thought I'll set up a like a blog and I'll do reviews and essays and talk about things.
And you call it A Critical Dragon.
And then I got busy, and that's the thing. It's life happens, and I was bullied into that by a couple of friends. YouTube channel, you and Steven Erickson bullied me into doing it.
Well, okay. That's why you started. You got bullied. That was the origin.
Yeah. You and Steven Erickson, you're both mean. But people may have known I don't refer to myself as a booktuber, and there's a reason for that. Like a substantial amount of what I talk about on my channel is film, television, general things about narrative, which applies across media. You go, so I'm not always talking about books. I'm not a booktuber. I'm a YouTuber who talks about narrative. I don't do TBRs. I don't do book hauls and things like that. I don't do the things that a lot of booktubers do, and a lot of people go to booktube channels for. I don't do those things. So I don't advertise myself as a booktuber because I don't do the things that the vast majority of booktubers do. I don't do reviews.
Right. What do you do?
Very little. My ongoing passion, the thing that I really wish that I was a true master of is understanding narrative. I am constantly learning more. And each time I learn a bit more, I realize how much more there is to learn. Like,
that's any field. Yeah, any realm. Yeah.
And I I did a sequence recently of just short videos taking the opening of books, because there are so many, particularly now with the explosion of social media, and you have different authors and critics and writing classes and editors, and everyone is giving advice about writing. And I am firmly of the opinion that if you are ever speaking to any of these people and you go, right, so let's talk about this writing advice where you said this, and they go, that's not what I said. In the context of X, if you do Y, you create this effect, and that's usually what a lot of the readers of that type are looking for. Suddenly there's a whole lot more qualifiers in it.
Right.
Because writing is not as straightforward and as simplistic as the bumper sticker aphorisms that people tend to remember.
Yeah.
That there's a reason why when someone goes, this is how you do world building, and it's part of a 9-hour series of videos. And someone goes, oh, but you said that thing in that one video. And you go, I did 9 hours on this. and you're talking about a 5-second clip. That's part of a sequence that is 45 minutes long, where I'm talking about all of the different aspects. But people they'll go, it's this thing. You said that thing. And they will latch onto it. In the same way that our students did when we were teaching and you were trying to explain something.
Wait, does this mean that you're not going to be on TikTok anytime soon?
What value would I add to TikTok? But But looking at the starts of books, because people will say, oh, you have to use a certain type of prose style. Um,
Yeah.
why? Oh, because that's good writing. And you go, so you're calling Dickens a bad writer, you're calling Austen a bad writer. Oh, well, they're a long time ago. You go, what about Glenn Cook? What about
What
you
about
start
Susanna
picking them,
Clark? Yeah.
and you start picking them out from all of these different time periods and different genres, and you go, look,
Yeah.
they're all using that technique.
Yeah.
It's not a bad technique,
Mm,
but it mightn't be the technique that you want to use. But you
mm,
should still know about it, know about the technique, know about the effect. And if that doesn't suit the story that you are telling, the story that you are narrating, then use something else. But to just sort of go, that's bad. Well, I can think of an example where it actually works out really well.
yeah.
But that's just one example. Well, now I've just thought of another one. But and because trying to distill down good writing, and you go, even the one genre of fantasy is so incredibly broad that there are very few things that you can point to that occur in all of the great works in the genre,
Hmm. Hmm.
because structure is going to be different in all the great works because they're not all written to the same structure. The type of language used, they were written at different times for different audiences, they were trying to evoke different things. There are so many different variables
Yeah.
that when someone says something very simplistic, like when writing a paragraph, always put the most important thing first. Not if the paragraph is
Oh, yeah.
focalized through the character's perception, because then what their eye hits first should come first in the sequence.
Yeah. Or what if you want a big surprise at the end of the paragraph? You know?
And and again, it's well, you have to do it this way. You go, why? Why is it this insistence on concrete rules? And a lot of it is, I think, in creative writing programs, when you are first learning, a lot of these things are presented as hard rules. This is what you have to learn. The reason
Right.
you have to learn is these are common mistakes that creative writers usually make. So we made these rules to stop you making these mistakes.
Right.
And then once you've completed that, you realize these are not concrete rules. They were there to stop you making that mistake. But now you understand what you are doing and the effect it creates. Now you can break that rule because you want to create the other effect.
Right.
That that is part and parcel of art. That art,
Mm.
otherwise, why not just have AIs write every single novel?
Oh gosh.
If
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
it is to be turned into, it should follow this structure and not
Yeah.
deviate. It should have these elements and not deviate. It should use this type of language and not deviate. You can choose this, this, or this. Those are your choices for your point of view. You go, you would turn fantasy writing into a production line where you would just have volume after volume printed that is variation on a theme, using the same techniques, the same structures, the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
And the first time you read some of the stuff, it might be good. The next time you go, oh, well, there's still variations here. It's interesting. But very quickly, it becomes repetitive because you start seeing the patterns.
Mm.
And the more you know about writing, the quicker it is to see patterns. But um, but that's why I don't like hearing, but this is how you do it. It must be done this way. And you're like, there's so much variation, so much flexibility within art. Imagine telling someone who paints portraits, and we're talking only about painting and only about portraits,
Yeah.
you must paint it this way. And you go, well, what about an abstract portrait? What about in the style of Van Gogh? What about in the style of Da Vinci? What about in the style of Matisse? What about in there are all these different styles of ways of doing portraits. And they go,
Yeah.
oh no, but that's not photorealistic. And you go, because it's a painting, not a photo. If you want a photo, take a photo.
Well, let
Art.
me play
Oh,
devil's advocate just a tiny bit. Not that I disagree with you at all, but what about this? What about the fact that in storytelling, there are certain tropes, we'll call them, or patterns. Patterns is a more neutral word. We'll use the word pattern. There are patterns that people recognize that serve a purpose, let's say, and in a sort of Campbellian sense here, right? And that I'm not going all the way to the simplified view of Campbell's hero's journey, where it's this, every story follows this it's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about just patterns that people recognize and that resonate within people and help them to feel a sense of organization. That in a way, don't people read stories because the actual world is chaotic and crazy, and so to make sense of it, we have stories where there are these patterns that make us feel like there is meaning and there is, something assuring in that. And if you go too far away from those patterns, then you're just leaving your readers maybe unsatisfied, or you're leaving them, feeling like, what is this? I don't know what this is. How can they connect to something if they can't latch on to something in it? Do you see what I'm saying?
But how can you have innovation if you don't deviate from the pattern?
Right. So
How can a genre grow without manipulating the pattern or throwing that part of the pattern away or doing something different with the pattern?
Exactly. So you're not throwing out the patterns, you're engaging with them, but you're pushing them in places they haven't been before. Yeah.
And also, when we think about narrative structure, yes, authors can use narrative structures as scaffolding to build their story on.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they then, when they're going through it, they're going to do things that don't neatly fit that pattern because they want to do something else.
Yeah.
Like, one of the reasons why David Eddings' books are so repetitive is he has the same types of characters going on the same quests, hitting the same story beats over and over again.
So too formulaic, you're saying.
It is, but it was a formula that the first time he used it, you go, oh, this is quite interesting. The second time you use it, you go, you've used the same formula again. I mean, there are a couple of variations here and there. Then the third time you go, right. The fourth time you're just going to do the same thing for it. Right. And
by the time you get to Rocky 6, you're like, I've seen this film before. Yeah. Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you can't still enjoy that comfort of the predictability. Why do we reread things? Why do we rewatch things that we have already seen?
Yeah.
Like, if you've seen a whodunit, you know whodunit, you know who the murderer was. But why do you rewatch it? Oh, well, now I want to see if I can spot all of the things that lead up to it, if all of the, and then okay, but that gives it a second watch. Yeah, but I want to watch it again because it's really satisfying to watch. And that's something built out of mystery, where the mystery is meant to be the thing. And yet there are some stories that we read and reread because we enjoy the experience. The structures that we talk about, narrative structures, and we can talk about Freytag's pyramid, we could talk about the 3-act structure, the 5-act structure, the 7-act structure. You could talk about Save the Cat. You could talk about the hero's journey. There are so many different narrative structures.
Right.
Yes, they can be used as scaffolding. But all of those things started out as descriptive about certain commonalities in certain narratives.
Yeah.
And all of them got to that stage by paring away everything that made the individual stories unique.
Right.
To look at the underlying skeleton. You and I, if, long after we're dead, if our skeletons put next to each other, they go, you know what? Those skeletons are roughly the same. But you and I are radically different people. So, well, how can that be if they both have exactly the same structure? Because you can have variations. But the idea that it has to follow that structure, that it has to do those things, that is where I think some people go wrong, where they go, no, this is the structure of a story. And it's Freytag's pyramid. There has to be an introduction. There has to be an instigating event. There has to be rising action. There has to be a climax. There has to be falling action. And then there has to be a denouement. This book doesn't have that, so it doesn't have a proper narrative structure.
Yeah.
And when I see that, I go, let me rephrase because I was about to say something rude, which is not true. You don't fully understand narrative structure. That is a narrative structure that is very common.
Not a cut and paste thing. Yeah. Yeah.
And just because a book doesn't conform to that doesn't mean it doesn't have a valid narrative structure. If the narrative has a structure at all, it has a narrative structure. The idea is to look at it to find out what is going on, not to match the narrative structure you are aware of onto these things. Because otherwise, How can you have both something conforming to a 3-act structure and Freytag's pyramid and the hero's journey all at once?
Ooh, that would be tricky.
Well, Star Wars: A New Hope basically does that.
Oh yeah, yeah. There you go. Yeah.
But people look at that and go, oh well. And again, it's the oversimplification of something. When we talk about something having an analogy or being inspired by, one of the things that Lucas was writing about in Star Wars: A New Hope, the Empire was in some respects linked to the rise, basically, of fascism in the US in response to the was it Vietnam War or the Korean War? I can't remember which, but it was partly commentary on those things.
More likely Vietnam. Yeah.
That the Empire was actually closer in analogy to the US, and the rebels were closer in analogy.
No. They had British accents. The rebels were Americans.
But how do you depict villainy? Oh, British accents. Let's make all the villains have English accents.
Yeah.
Because then that makes them readily identifiable. And to sell to a market in the States, there was a time when every villain was a very well-spoken.
Because we're reliving the revolution. So, yeah.
But then someone would say, oh, but this, and you go, it's not a direct analogy. It's not directly telling that story, but that was an inspiration.
Yeah.
And because it's an inspiration, that means he can have British accents or English accents for the Empire, even though the inspiration from it came from an articulation of the rise of fascism in the States, but using iconography from Nazi Germany and melding things together, because you take from different places. It's rarely that it is just this one thing. And like recently, the film A Glass Onion, people go, oh, well, they're just making fun of Elon Musk. You go, with one of the characters. And you go, no, it's not just, it is not a one-to-one analogy. Stop being so closed in your interpretation. It is this literalism and lack of flexibility in understanding these things and going, The Little Mermaid, it's a Danish folktale. Well, no, it is a folktale that one of the earlier recordings we have is Danish, but the mermaid herself is not Danish, is she? She's a mermaid. So she's not Danish. She shouldn't be played by someone who looks Danish. She's a mermaid. She should look different to the Danish people.
Yeah.
And also, what do the Danish people look like? And if we're going to cast it, if we want to be authentic to the original version, and not the and you go, it's not the original, it's an early version, not the original, because we don't have access to a lot of the earlier versions that were oral. But if we're going to do that, who do we cast in the film? Well, you can't cast any Americans. You have to cast Danish people because it's Danish. Is it set in Denmark? No, it's set in a fairy tale land that's based in Denmark. Well, okay, but in this fairy tale land that originally was inspired by Denmark, it's not in Denmark. So it can be in a fairy tale land. We'll just change the rules and people there can have an American accent because it's easier to cast that.
Well, let's just accept, though, that all representatives of evil empires have to have British accents, unless you're James Earl Jones, and then because you sound so awesome, you can have any accent you want.
But like all of these things, it's the oversimplification, because people want the 30-second soundbite.
Yeah.
They don't want to hear it's complicated. Right, let me explain some of the general points and then some of the general exceptions to the general points. And then you go, that's too much. I just want to, is it good or bad? Is it black or white? Does it fit or doesn't it?
Right.
People want simple answers, but not everyone does, which is why, channels like mine have people who come and watch my videos where I'm going,
even I watch your videos.
That's only so you can leave mean comments.
That's true.
But we can't make assumptions about what everyone wants or what everyone likes. And that's one of the great things is the range of channels, of different approaches that we can take.
Right.
But the one that I kind of push back against, not in a mean-spirited way, but is the overly simplified form.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we do that, we reduce critical thinking. This Orwell talked about this in 1984.
Yes.
Why have all of the different words that mean these things when you just have good, plus good, double plus good?
Yeah.
You don't need any of the other ones. And you go, there's a reason the other ones have different connotations. The other ones have slightly different meanings. The
Yeah.
other ones convey different information and different feelings. No, but you shouldn't have that. Why? What is wrong with artistic expression?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, this has been an awesome discussion, and I know we could keep going. But you know, it probably might be a nice place for us to come to a conclusion, I guess. But this has been so much fun. I really love talking with you, AP, and I feel like I learn something every time. And I really appreciate you being willing to come on Dear Dr. Fantasy. And I feel like we got a fairly good glimpse into the brain of a critical dragon, which is really quite fascinating.
Which is a bunch of mad squirrels chasing each other around because you go, you asked about that thing, so I'm talking about it, and then you go, oh, but it links to that thing, which also links to that, and then half an hour later, oh, hang on, your question was actually about that. Let me go back to that.
Yeah.
That's the squirrels in my brain are, yeah.
But they're fun to watch. So, you know.
But Philip, thank you very much for inviting me on. This has been a lot of fun, and I do apologize that I go off on mad rambling tirades.
But they do make sense, so it's okay.
Sometimes.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. And if you don't know what his channel is, AP's channel is called A Critical Dragon. There will, of course, be a link to it in the description for you to go and check it out. But it is my favorite place, and there's no comparison, in my opinion. It is my favorite place to go and learn about narrative, to learn about how stories are told, where we can find ourselves in stories and how they relate to us, what they can mean for us, how they enrich our lives. So it's just a wonderful place to go and learn about storytelling, and go and check it out. All right. Until next time.